Introduction. In the heart of a quaint, peaceful town, nestled amidst rolling hills and picturesque landscapes, there lived a man whose very presence sent shivers down the spines of its inhabitants. His name was Ethan, a figure who had etched himself into the annals of local law, but not for any virtuous reasons. Instead, he had gained notoriety as the Unwanted Troublemaker, a title that perfectly encapsulated his relentless pursuit of chaos and malevolence. Ethan was a man shrouded in a cloud of darkness, a darkness that had its origins in a painful and troubled childhood. His early years were marred by abuse and neglect, leaving scars that ran deep and festered within his soul. These formative experiences had twisted his very being, causing him to seek solace in the suffering of others. It was as though his heart had grown callous, incapable of experiencing the warmth of genuine human connection. The residents of the town had long been subjected to Ethan's malicious antics. His reign of havoc knew no bounds, as he vandalized property, spread slanderous rumors, and played cruel pranks that left a trail of misery in his wake. No one was immune to his malevolence, and as time went on, the atmosphere in the town was perpetually marred by his devious actions. Yet, amidst the sea of disdain and resentment that surrounded him, a faint glimmer of compassion persisted. Neighbors and acquaintances, despite their understandable anger and frustration, couldn't ignore the torment that lay beneath Ethan's veneer of cruelty. They saw a man who, for all his wickedness, seemed to be drowning in his own anguish. So, they reached out, urging him to seek therapy, hoping to help him confront the demons that haunted his past. But to their dismay, Ethan brushed off their concerns, dismissing their well-intentioned advice as the meddling of those who couldn't possibly comprehend the depth of his pain. As life continued to unfold in this small, troubled town, the people began to wonder if there was any way to halt the relentless march of the unwanted troublemaker. What they couldn't foresee, however, was the harrowing turn of events that would ultimately confront Ethan with the consequences of his actions, leading to a reckoning he had long avoided. This is the story of a man whose life was a tapestry woven with threads of suffering, cruelty, and despair. A man whose collision with the consequences of his actions would not only change the course of his existence, but also have a profound impact on the entire community. It is a tale that delves deep into the human condition, exploring the destructive power of hatred and the transformative potential of compassion and redemption. In the end, it reminds us that even in the darkest of hearts, there exists a glimmer of hope, and that even the most unwanted souls can find a path to redemption when the community extends a hand of understanding and love.
Chapter 1: The Arrival. In a town where daily life followed the rhythmic cadence of tranquility, Ethan's arrival was like a discordant note in a symphony. The townspeople still remember the day he first appeared, an outsider who had inexplicably chosen their serene corner of the world as his new home. Ethan's physical appearance did little to dispel the unease his presence brought. His disheveled hair and scruffy beard gave him an unkempt, almost feral appearance. He had piercing, cold eyes that seemed to be devoid of any warmth, and his posture exuded an air of defiance, as if he were daring the world to challenge him. From the moment he set foot in the town, it was clear that Ethan was different. While most newcomers were greeted with warm smiles and open arms, he was met with wary glances and hesitant greetings. The townsfolk had an uncanny ability to sense trouble on the horizon, and Ethan embodied that foreboding sense of impending chaos. As the days turned into weeks and then months, the whispers and murmurs about Ethan grew louder. His malicious reputation began to take shape as the townspeople recounted stories of his disruptive behavior. He was known for his insatiable desire to create problems for others, and nobody was immune to his malevolence. His actions ranged from petty thefts to more elaborate schemes that left his victims in states of disbelief and frustration. Despite his apparent indifference to the pain he caused, Ethan had a knack for evading the consequences of his actions. The townspeople soon realized that they were dealing with a master manipulator, a man who reveled in the misery he spread and took great pleasure in the chaos he sowed. This only served to deepen the divide between him and the community, as they began to refer to him in hushed tones as the Unwanted Troublemaker. The townsfolk, while initially disturbed by his presence, eventually began to organize against him. They shared stories, warned each other about his schemes, and formed an unspoken alliance to protect one another from his malevolence. Their determination to stand up to the unwanted troublemaker was a testament to their unity in the face of adversity. As the tension in the town mounted, it became clear that the arrival of Ethan marked a turning point in the tranquil existence of its inhabitants. Little did they know that the story of the unwanted troublemaker was just beginning, and that it would soon take a tragic and unexpected turn that would challenge their very understanding of human nature and compassion.
Chapter 2: The Dark Secrets. Beneath the facade of the unwanted troublemaker lay a tragic narrative, a narrative that started in Ethan's early years, a narrative that would eventually shed light on the darkness that consumed his soul. Ethan's childhood had been a crucible of pain and neglect. He was born into a family marked by dysfunction and suffering. His parents, struggling with their own demons, had neither the capacity nor the inclination to provide the love and care that a child so desperately needed. The memories of his youth were etched with the scars of abuse and abandonment. The emotional wounds inflicted upon him were deep, and they festered over the years. While many children are nurtured and taught to understand the virtues of love, empathy, and kindness, Ethan learned a very different set of lessons. His world was one where cruelty and indifference were the norm, where his worth was constantly questioned, and where the only reliable emotion he experienced was pain. These early experiences had a profound impact on Ethan's psyche. They distorted his perception of the world, making him view it as a hostile and unforgiving place. The kindness and compassion that others offered seemed foreign and perplexing to him, as if they belonged to an alien realm he could never access. In his darkest moments, he came to believe that the only way to regain some semblance of control and power in a world that had victimized him was to inflict pain on others. The suffering he caused to those around him was his way of asserting dominance, of proving to himself that he was no longer the powerless child he once had been. Ethan's internal struggles, the torment that raged within him, remained well hidden from the world. He rarely spoke of his past, preferring instead to let his actions speak for him. He harbored his demons in the shadows, guarding his secrets with a fierce determination, never allowing anyone to glimpse the turmoil that churned within.
As the town's residents grappled with the malevolence of the unwanted troublemaker, they began to see a different side of Ethan. Some, perhaps fueled by their own experiences with adversity, wondered if there might be more to the story. They couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for a man who had been so thoroughly broken by life's cruelties. In the chapters that followed, the residents would learn that behind every villain, there was a story. A story of suffering, of trauma, and of unresolved pain. The unwanted troublemaker's past, a past marred by a childhood filled with darkness, would soon come to the forefront, providing a new perspective on the man who had sown chaos in their once peaceful town.
Chapter 3: The Town's Misery. Ethan's reign of malevolence continued to cast a long, dark shadow over the town, and with each passing day, the collective misery of its inhabitants grew more pronounced. His actions had a way of infecting the community, creating an atmosphere of unease and apprehension that was hard to shake. The townspeople found themselves living in a state of perpetual vigilance. They locked their doors, kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, and constantly wondered when the next act of sabotage or cruelty would strike. No one was immune to the unwanted troublemaker's sinister machinations. His antics ranged from seemingly harmless pranks, like placing thumbtacks on bicycle seats or spreading rumors to destroy reputations, to more sinister deeds, such as vandalism and theft. These acts left a trail of frustration, anger, and despair in their wake, as the victims struggled to understand why they had been targeted and why anyone would derive pleasure from their suffering. As the unwanted troublemaker's actions escalated, so did the town's resolve to protect itself. People banded together to share stories, warnings, and advice on how to safeguard their homes and businesses. Community meetings became a forum for residents to express their fear and frustration, to brainstorm strategies for dealing with Ethan, and to offer support to one another. The once close-knit community was fraying at the edges. Suspicion and distrust crept into the relationships that had once been built on mutual trust and friendship. Neighbors began to eye each other with a sense of unease, wondering if anyone might be colluding with the unwanted troublemaker or secretly enabling his actions. Despite the chaos that surrounded them, there were still pockets of compassion within the town. Acts of kindness and solidarity emerged in response to the adversity they faced. Neighbors looked out for each other, offering help and support to those who had been victimized by Ethan's schemes. It was as if, in the face of a common enemy, the community's bonds were being tested and, in some cases, strengthened. The town's misery became a collective burden, one that weighed heavily on the hearts of its residents. They yearned for a return to the days of peace and harmony, when their lives were not marred by the actions of the unwanted troublemaker. Little did they know that the events in this seemingly idyllic town were hurtling towards a dramatic turning point, one that would force them to confront their own humanity and offer them an unexpected opportunity for healing and redemption.
Chapter 4: A Cry for Help. As the unwanted troublemaker's reign of chaos continued, the townspeople's frustration and anger grew, and many couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to stop him from causing further harm. It was during these difficult times that a few residents, driven by empathy and concern, decided to reach out to Ethan in an attempt to understand and potentially alleviate the torment that drove his malevolence. Neighbors who had once been targets of his pranks and malicious actions found the courage to approach him with genuine concern. They hoped that by extending a helping hand, they might be able to address the underlying issues that had turned Ethan into the unwanted troublemaker. Ethan's initial reaction was a mixture of hostility and defensiveness. He was unused to kindness and was quick to interpret any attempt at help as an intrusion or an attempt to manipulate him. However, some in the town were undeterred and persisted in their efforts to break through the emotional fortress that Ethan had built around himself. They encouraged him to seek professional therapy, understanding that the root of his malevolence lay in the scars of his troubled past. They tried to convey that healing was possible, that he could transcend the cycle of pain and cruelty that had ensnared him. Yet, Ethan remained stubborn and resistant to change. He dismissed their well-intentioned advice, viewing them as meddlers who couldn't possibly comprehend the depth of his pain. He seemed determined to cling to his role as the unwanted troublemaker, as if it were the only identity he knew. The town's collective efforts to help Ethan were met with resistance and, at times, despair. It became clear that his transformation, if it were to occur, would be an uphill battle, and the townspeople faced the sobering reality that some wounds ran too deep to be easily healed. While the unwanted troublemaker's actions did not cease, a new dynamic was emerging within the town. It was a dynamic that reflected the capacity of compassion and the resilience of human kindness, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable malevolence. The residents who had reached out to Ethan were driven by a deep desire to understand the roots of his pain, and though their initial attempts bore little fruit, they were planting the seeds of potential change in the future. As the chapter came to a close, the town remained divided, with many fearing the unwanted troublemaker's next move and others hoping for his redemption. Little did they know that a dramatic event would soon shake their community to its core, forcing them to confront the consequences of their actions and ultimately test the bounds of their compassion and humanity.
Chapter 5: The Unavoidable Collision. The small town that had been plagued by the unwanted troublemaker for so long was about to witness a fateful turn of events that would alter the course of its history. It was an evening like any other, as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Ethan, consumed by his familiar resentment and anger, climbed into his car. His thoughts were a tangled web of frustration and despair, a reflection of the turmoil that had become his daily existence. It was as though he were carrying the weight of his past on his shoulders, a burden that he could neither shed nor escape. As he sped through town, his vision blurred by the emotional tempest that raged within, he paid little heed to the rules of the road. Red lights, stop signs, and the safety of others were inconsequential in his state of mind. His actions were a reflection of his ever-present desire to disrupt and inflict suffering, and he had become dangerously reckless in his pursuit of chaos. Unbeknownst to Ethan, on this very evening, another vehicle was approaching the same intersection. The driver, a mother with her 2 young children in the back seat, was oblivious to the impending catastrophe. The collision that occurred was both violent and catastrophic, the sound of twisted metal and shattering glass ringing through the air. The impact sent shockwaves through the town. Bystanders rushed to the scene, their hearts heavy with dread as they realized the severity of the accident. The other vehicle had been mangled, and the occupants were trapped inside, their cries of pain and fear echoing through the night. It was a moment that brought the town to a collective standstill. The chaos that had defined their existence in recent times seemed to pale in comparison to the stark reality of a devastating accident, one that had the potential to claim innocent lives. As the emergency services arrived and worked to extract the injured from the wreckage, it became clear that the consequences of this collision were far-reaching. The town's residents watched in shock and sorrow as the mother and her children were rushed to the hospital, their lives hanging in the balance. Ethan, too, had suffered injuries in the collision, and as he lay in his own damaged vehicle, he was confronted with the stark reality of his actions. In the midst of the chaos and suffering he had caused, he was now a victim himself, forced to confront the repercussions of his reckless behavior. The collision marked a turning point in the story of the unwanted troublemaker and the town that had long borne the weight of his malevolence. It was a moment of reckoning, a tragic reminder that actions, even those driven by anger and resentment, have consequences that cannot be escaped. As the town grappled with the aftermath of this fateful night, they were about to discover that even in their darkest hour, there was a glimmer of hope and an opportunity for redemption.
Chapter 6: The Unwanted Suffering. The aftermath of the collision brought a wave of suffering and sorrow that engulfed the small town. The occupants of the other car, a mother and her 2 young children, lay in the hospital, their injuries severe and their lives hanging in the balance. The entire community felt the weight of this tragedy, and the stark contrast between their compassion and Ethan's malevolence became all the more evident. News of the accident spread through the town like wildfire, and it was met with an outpouring of sympathy and support. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers rallied around the injured family, offering assistance, comfort, and prayers. It was a testament to the resilience and unity of the community, as they set aside their differences to provide solace and care to those who had been victimized by the unwanted troublemaker's recklessness. The town organized fundraisers to help cover the medical expenses and support the family in their time of need. Local businesses donated supplies, and volunteers offered their time to ensure the family's well-being. It was as if, in the face of tragedy, the community had found a renewed sense of purpose and humanity. Ethan, lying in his hospital bed, had ample time to reflect on the consequences of his actions. The collision had forced him to confront the stark reality of his malevolence, the suffering he had inflicted upon others, and the destruction he had wrought. As he grappled with his own injuries, he began to recognize the gravity of his behavior and the misery he had brought upon himself and those he had harmed. The contrast between the unwanted troublemaker and the townspeople couldn't have been starker. While the former had reveled in the suffering of others, the latter had risen above their differences to offer compassion and support to those in need. The collision had laid bare the true character of the town's residents, showcasing the power of empathy, unity, and the ability to transcend the darkness that had plagued their lives. the suffering that the collision had brought upon the innocent family would serve as a catalyst for change. The town had reached a critical juncture, where they could choose to continue down the path of division and resentment, or they could seize the opportunity to heal and rebuild as a more compassionate and united community. As the injured family fought for their recovery, the unwanted troublemaker himself faced a choice: to remain mired in his past actions or to find a way to redeem himself and seek forgiveness. The small town was on the brink of transformation, and the future held the promise of redemption and healing for all its inhabitants.
Chapter 7: The Community's Realization. The collision had cast a pall of sorrow over the small town, and as news of the accident spread like wildfire, the community found itself grappling with an unexpected and complex realization. Despite the years of animosity and anger they had harbored towards the unwanted troublemaker, the townspeople couldn't help but feel a profound sense of sorrow for him. The incident had triggered a collective introspection among the residents. They had long viewed Ethan as the embodiment of malevolence, a force that had disrupted their peace and harmony. They had demonized him and wished for his removal from their lives. However, the sight of him lying injured in a hospital bed, confronting the consequences of his actions, stirred a wellspring of empathy in their hearts. It became clear that the unwanted troublemaker was not invincible, nor was he immune to pain and suffering. His vulnerability exposed a different facet of his character, one that was wounded and in need of healing. The town's residents, who had been at the receiving end of his malevolence, couldn't help but ponder the origins of his bitterness and cruelty. Conversations sprang up in homes, community gatherings, and even in the hospital waiting room where the injured family struggled to recover. People wondered about the experiences that had turned Ethan into the person he had become. Some recalled stories from his past, stories of a difficult and abusive childhood, and they realized that perhaps they had been too quick to judge, too hasty in casting him as a villain without considering the circumstances that had shaped him. This realization, though somber and reflective, offered a glimmer of hope. It was a reminder that even the most troubled souls could find redemption if given the opportunity. The community, once divided by its disdain for Ethan, was beginning to appreciate the complexity of human nature and the power of compassion. The injured family, too, played a role in this realization. Their courage, resilience, and forgiveness in the face of adversity served as a beacon of light. Instead of harboring resentment towards Ethan, they chose to focus on their recovery and healing. Their example inspired the town to confront the past, seek reconciliation, and explore the possibility of a brighter, more compassionate future. The collision had not only shattered vehicles and bones, but also the walls of prejudice and hatred that had divided the town for so long. The unwanted troublemaker's fate hung in the balance, and the small community faced a choice: to continue down the path of division and hostility, or to offer a chance for redemption and healing to a man who had long been seen as the town's tormentor. The future of the town was uncertain, but it was infused with the potential for transformation and compassion.
Chapter 8: The Bitter End. The hospital room where Ethan lay, his life hanging in the balance, was a stark contrast to the chaotic and malevolent world he had once thrived in. The unwanted troublemaker, now battered and broken, was facing the consequences of his actions, and it was a moment of reckoning that would define the final chapter of his story. Ethan's injuries, sustained in the collision he had caused, were severe. He was confined to a sterile hospital bed, a network of tubes and monitors connecting him to machines that fought to keep him alive. The gravity of his own condition, as well as the suffering he had inflicted on others, weighed heavily on him. In the silence of that hospital room, with his body weakened and his spirit humbled, Ethan had time for reflection. The memories of his malevolent acts, the pain he had intentionally caused others, and the destruction he had wrought upon his community haunted him. It was a moment of profound clarity as he recognized the enormity of his behavior, and the misery he had brought upon himself and those around him. He could no longer deny the consequences of his actions, nor the harm he had inflicted upon innocent people. The collision had forced him to confront the stark reality of his choices, the suffering he had sown, and the lives he had disrupted. In his vulnerability and pain, he could no longer escape the truth that had eluded him for so long. Ethan's transformation was not an instant one, but rather a slow and painful journey. He began to grapple with remorse and regret, understanding the depth of the wounds he had inflicted upon others and himself. The bitterness and resentment that had fueled his malevolence began to wither away as he faced his own suffering. The town, too, was undergoing a transformation of its own. The collision and its aftermath had forced the community to re-evaluate its approach to the unwanted troublemaker. They were now confronted with a man who had reached his lowest point, a man who had the potential for change and redemption. The compassion and empathy that the townspeople had discovered within themselves gave them the strength to offer support to someone they had long viewed as an adversary. The chapter marked the beginning of the end for the unwanted troublemaker. It was a period of painful introspection and the slow, arduous process of seeking forgiveness and redemption. The small town, once plagued by the chaos and malevolence he had sown, was now faced with a choice: to extend a hand of understanding and support to a man in his darkest hour, or to let him languish in his own bitterness. The future remained uncertain, but it held the potential for redemption and healing for both the unwanted troublemaker and the community that had long been divided by his actions.
Chapter 9: Redemption and Reflection. In the final moments of his life, Ethan's room in the hospital seemed to hold a solemn stillness, as if time itself had slowed down. The once vibrant unwanted troublemaker, now a mere shell of his former self, lay in his hospital bed, his body weakened, his spirit humbled. It was a poignant chapter in his story, a moment of reflection and reckoning. Ethan's mind, no longer clouded by anger and resentment, allowed him to revisit the chronicles of his life. He saw the cruelty and pain he had inflicted on others, the lives he had disrupted, and the suffering he had sown in his relentless pursuit of chaos. In the quiet solitude of his hospital room, he could no longer deny the gravity of his actions. As he reflected on the path that had led him to this point, he realized that his malevolence had been a self-destructive force. The darkness that had consumed him had also left him in a state of perpetual suffering. The unwanted troublemaker had become the embodiment of his own torment, and it was a revelation that weighed heavily on his conscience. Meanwhile, the town, once divided by hatred and animosity, had undergone a profound transformation. The collision and its aftermath had spurred the community to extend a hand of understanding and support to the man they had long reviled. The compassion and empathy that had emerged in response to the tragedy had brought the town together, forging a newfound sense of unity and purpose. In his final moments, the townspeople gathered around Ethan's hospital bed, not as adversaries, but as fellow human beings. They offered him their forgiveness and their hope for redemption. They had come to understand that even the most deeply troubled souls could find a path to healing when the community extended a hand of love and understanding. As Ethan took his last breath, a sense of peace washed over him. He had found a measure of redemption, not through the chaos he had once sown, but through the compassion and forgiveness of those he had harmed. His tragic story served as a somber reminder of the destructive power of hatred and the transformative potential of compassion and forgiveness. The town, once marred by division and strife, had discovered the healing power of unity and understanding. In the wake of the unwanted troublemaker's passing, the community emerged stronger and more compassionate, bound together by the shared experience of redemption and the hope for a brighter future. The chapters of their lives continued, now marked by the understanding that even the most troubled souls can find their way back to the light when offered a hand of love and support.
Indeed, in the end, Ethan's life left an indelible mark on the town, serving as a powerful testament to the dual forces of hatred and compassion. His story was a somber reminder of the immense destructive power that hatred and resentment could wield, not only tearing apart the fabric of a community but also consuming the individual who harbored those emotions. Yet, through the transformative potential of compassion and forgiveness, Ethan's tragic narrative offered a glimmer of hope and redemption. His journey, though fraught with sorrow and malevolence, demonstrated that even the most deeply troubled souls could find a path to healing and redemption when the community extended a hand of understanding and love. It revealed the human capacity to rise above hatred and division, to embrace empathy and forgiveness, and to rebuild the bonds of a fractured community. Ethan's legacy was a stark reminder that the choice between perpetuating hatred or embracing compassion was a defining moment for individuals and communities alike. His story underscored the profound impact of such choices and left the town forever changed, carrying the lessons of his life into a future marked by unity, empathy, and the enduring belief in the potential for redemption, even in the darkest of hearts.